Thank you, Selena, for that warm welcome. Can you all hear me? Yeah! I can use my outside voice. Thank you all for having me. As Taliha mentioned, I am from Chicago. It's actually my very first time in Portland. So thank you all for having me. I know I have 20 minutes and I'm going to try my best to stay within the time frame. So there's only so much I can talk about in 20 minutes, so this will be sort of an overview. I just want to start off by saying I made my own quote, where don't be embarrassed that you do not know something that you were never taught. Be proud that you are now willing to learn. And I wrote that because I meet so many people who say, oh my God, I can't believe I never learned that. I feel so bad that I didn't know that. And I'm like, but it's not your fault that nobody taught you, but you're actually willing and open to learn now. So that's what you need to be proud of. I want to thank Aisha Cunning, Martin Osborne, Erica Caldwell, Lisa Klein-Wolf, Jill Altman for inviting me, for Philippe Hidisek for introducing me to the school, and for the Black Student Union students, Sebastian, Selena, Davinia, and Giselle, and many others, and they're all the distinguished guests for having me. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Woodrow Wilson versus my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. When we were first contacted, when my family was first contacted by the former principal, Hidisek, about the name change, we were kind of almost fell out of our chair because I actually know the history of Woodrow Wilson and my great-grandmother, and I was like, oh my God, like you can't get more drastic difference between two people. And so I'm going to just talk about the connection between them and the contrast between them. And hopefully you all feel that what Ida represents is what you represent versus what Wilson represented. So just before I get started on them, I'll tell you how I'm related to Ida B. Wells. So she was married to a man named Barnett, Ferdinand Barnett. So she hyphenated her name to Ida B. Wells Barnett. She had 4 children, or they had 4 children together. My grandmother was their youngest daughter, and her name was Alfreda Barnett. She got married to a man named Benjamin Duster. They had 5 children. Their middle son was Donald Duster. And that's how I have the last name Duster. And I have 2 brothers, Dan and Dave. So that's the lineage of why my name is not Wells. Okay, so just a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. And you all can Google him. There's a lot of information about him. So I'm just going to tell you sort of bullet pointed information. He was originally from Virginia. And that's important because Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. And Woodrow Wilson was old enough to remember and to grow up in a time when in Virginia people considered the South losing the war to the War of Northern Aggression, and how the formerly Confederate states were wronged by these northern intrusioners. And that's important as far as his mentality. He eventually became the governor of New Jersey before he ran for president, and he became the 28th president of the United States, and he served for 2 terms. During his campaign, he campaigned, and a lot of African Americans were attracted to his platform because there was a lot of corruption, or there was a lot of it's similar to what's going on now, where there were a lot of billionaires that were running everything. They were titans of business, and people were kind of getting tired of that, and so he campaigned on the idea that he was going to bust up these monopolies. You might have heard about Rockefeller, Carnegie Mellon, Andrew Carnegie, some of these people that became titans of business, Chrysler and JP Morgan. And so he campaigned on busting those up and making things more equal for other people who were not billionaires at that time. He campaigns on eliminating unethical business practices, on creating affordable living standards, and restoring integrity. And a lot of the things that he was talking about appealed to the middle class. So African Americans, during his campaign, supported him and they were excited about him becoming president. One thing that I found interesting is that as far as our lifetime and my great-grandmother's lifetime, she lived through the pandemic of 1918. And President Wilson was president during World War I. So we all have something in common with Ida B. Wells. We've lived through a pandemic. Okay, so before he became president, the day before his inauguration, there was a march in Washington, D.C. of suffragists. There were 5,000 women who decided to march right before he got inaugurated to put pressure on President Wilson, the incoming President Wilson, to pass legislation to make women have the right to vote, to have the suffrage vote. And my great-grandmother participated in that march, and this is a picture of her in the march. Now she came with a delegation from Illinois, a multiracial delegation from Illinois, and she had been working across races in Illinois. And when they got to Washington, the people who were organizing the march asked all the black women to march in the back of the parade because the reason that they gave was that they didn't want white women from the South to be insulted. And my great-grandmother was like, I don't think so. She was 51 years old, and I am sure she was older than the organizers of the march. And she had been fighting for a long time, and so she was not going back anywhere. And so what she did was that she pretended to agree. And they couldn't find her the day of the march, and then she walked alongside the parade route, and she jumped out of the crowd into the front of the Illinois delegation. So she desegregated the parade. This was the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in March 3rd, 1913. So Woodrow Wilson gets in office. What does he do? Immediately resegregates the federal government. The federal government had actually been integrated. And as I mentioned, he was from Virginia, so he was a segregationist. And he decided to segregate the federal government, have separate bathrooms, separate lunchrooms, separate offices, separate entrances for black people. And when they couldn't segregate people specifically by room, then what they did was they put like barriers inside of the room, like kind of screens, and isolated the black employees away from the white employees. So that didn't go very well over with my great-grandmother. So my great-grandmother and William Monroe Trotter went to the White House and spoke to Woodrow Wilson and asked him, like, you can't do this to the federal government. You need to continue on with what it had been. And the federal government was a leg up for a lot of African Americans into the middle class. It was a prestigious kind of job to have right after the Civil War. So it had been over 60 years, almost 60 years of integration. And so this was unprecedented for Woodrow Wilson to do this. He also screened Birth of a Nation. How many of you, by clap, have heard of the movie Birth of a Nation? Okay, so some of you. Birth of a Nation was considered a cinematic marvel. And it was, except for the subject matter. D.W. Griffith, way back in the day, films were silent, and they were all black and white. And D.W. Griffith, and they were short. So D.W. Griffith was the filmmaker, did make history by making a long-form film. The film is 3 hours long. It is about how the southern way of life was being destroyed by black people. And it was basically a propaganda piece to show that black men are dangerous and white women need to be protected. And so the whole film is about that. These men that were dangerous and these women that needed to be protected, and they showed black men like chasing white women. Have you ever seen it? Or you just heard about it? Well, if you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube. But it was highly offensive to African Americans because it fed into the stereotype of black criminality. It was used as a propaganda tool for the Klan. That's how bad that film was. And my great-grandmother protested that film, and she urged people to boycott it. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson screened it at the White House, so he endorsed it on a national level. He also implemented the Espionage Act in 1917, which basically, because this was the beginning of World War I, which basically made it seem like if you criticize the United States government in any way, then you'll be charged with treason. Well, my great-grandmother decided to criticize the United States government. There was an incident that happened in Texas at a place called Fort Logan, where black soldiers and white soldiers got into a clash. And brief overview is that the black soldiers were charged with, what do you call it? They were charged with going against the government, and they were executed. So my great-grandmother had a problem with that, and so she decided to protest the United States government. I've started my book off with this incident because she made buttons that said "Murdered Negro Soldiers." And that was in honor of the soldiers who had been killed. And so she was considered criticizing the United States government, and the FBI came to visit her and told her that she needed to stop distributing these buttons or she would be arrested under the Espionage Act. And she was like, go ahead and arrest me. And he also segregated the army. Wilson segregated the army. My great-grandmother's stepson was in the army, so she had a problem with that. And so after the war ended, there was a peace conference in Paris. People had been invited from all over the world to talk about how to create peace. She was invited, but then Wilson revoked her passport. So these are some ways that their lives interacted. And I wanted to share this quote with you because this is what my great-grandmother said when the FBI came to charge her with treason. She said, "I'd rather go down in history as one lone Negro who dared to tell the government that it had done a dastardly thing than to save my skin by taking back what I have said. I would consider it an honor to spend whatever years are necessary in prison as the one member of the race who protested, rather than be with all the 11,999,999 Negroes who didn't have to go to prison because they kept their mouths shut." And that's one of my favorite quotes of my great-grandmother, because she was basically like, I don't care what you say, I'm standing by what I have to say. And this is her basically standing up to the President of the United States. She also had a problem with, like I said, he segregated the government. Okay, I can't find my paper. But she wrote a letter to him in 1918, where she wrote, "The Negro Fellowship League calls upon you to countermand General Bunyan's number 35 for 92nd Division, Camp Funson, Kansas, enjoining officers and soldiers to refrain from going into public places where their presence is resented because of color. His dictum, the loyal public service, is putting pleasure above general. It is not applied to white soldiers, destroys all civil rights, causes fresh discrimination, fosters free prejudice, humiliates our race, degrades the army uniform. To order so vicious and undemocratic has been issued in any armies fighting Germany. Protect American soldiers at home before sending them abroad in democracy's war." So this is again an example of how my great-grandmother stood up to Woodrow Wilson, because he was resegregating the army, or segregating the army, and she felt that the black soldiers were treated worse in this country than they were overseas. And they were being asked to fight for freedom and democracy overseas, but then they were being disrespected here in their own country. So to conclude, I hope that you all feel that it is a huge, huge thing for your school to change the name from Woodrow Wilson to Ida B. Wells, because they stood for different things. I feel diametrically opposed things. And so Woodrow Wilson stood for segregation. He stood for big business. He also, and we can remember this from our own time, he denied the pandemic of 1918 that she actually had to live through. And he was a proponent of white supremacy. And I hope you all agree that my great-grandmother was against white supremacy. She was for integration. She was for equal rights for everybody. And so I'm just, hopefully by show of applause, do you hopefully agree that this was a good change? And Ida B. Wells is somebody that I hope it gives you some perspective of why my family feels incredibly honored that here in Portland, you all feel that what my great-grandmother represented and what she worked for is what you want to represent you and what you all represent out in the world. Thank you.